All right. Hey everybody, Alex here, and welcome to another video. So I've been meaning to make this one for a while, and truthfully, I don't know how many parts this is going to be. I really consider my Final Fantasy XI career, as it were, to be in three different arcs. Me playing it, me hitting stride, and me kind of fading away. And it may be a little bit longer because when it comes to MMOs in general, as many amazing memories as I have of this game, I have to acknowledge the fact that upon its release in 2002, with breaks here and there, I really played this game for the better half of a decade. And there is a degree of addiction that comes with an MMO format, which is why I'm really jaded on it at this point. But also, time and place, MMOs aren't designed the way Final Fantasy XI is designed anymore either. 14 is a prime example of that, and while I did have a stint with that, it just didn't click. Now, mind you, I did the original version, which was broken as all get out, but even me taking like a 20-minute look and a little bit of gameplay of 14, it's almost like a gag reflex. Like my body just rejects it. Just the way quests work and hubs and all that stuff, it kind of just gets under my skin, which is very strange considering games like, I'll say, even my beloved Xenoblade Chronicles have a little bit of that MMO formula in it, but I think because it's a single player contained experience, and I know once I see credits it's over, like I can just play it no problem. But anyway, Final Fantasy XI. Final Fantasy XI came out in 2002. This was a very interesting time in games for me personally, because I was playing stuff a little bit, and I was transitioning from high school into college. Now, when Final Fantasy XI originally came out in Japan, I think it was in May of 2002, roughly, and it was the first game to have cross-platform between PlayStation 2 and Windows, to my knowledge, or at least any form of cross-platform. And it did so by using this wonderful service, if anybody's played Final Fantasy XI, called Play Online. And Play Online was the most archaic of launchers you would have ever seen. It was like dial-up AOL internet for the sake of having dial-up AOL internet. It literally served no purpose other than launching Final Fantasy XI and Tetramaster, which was a whole game in and of itself. One of the best mini games, one of the best collectible card games. I do not know why Square Enix never made that into a physical product, even as a novelty. Because I would have bought that just to have it as like a coffee table piece for like my little nerd shrine in the other room. Because I played a lot of Tetramaster. And it was also great when there was downtime on Final Fantasy XI just to play that too. I don't even know if it's still supported. But anyway, Play Online was really designed just to do these two things, and that was it. And Final Fantasy XI came with the hard drive and all that fun stuff. And it was really interesting. We would find out in the future that all of the version expansion updates were always designed around the PS2 first, because the PS2 had a limited amount of resources they could tap into. So even though we were getting new content and new areas and classes and everything else, there was always a deviation of something else in terms of color and in terms of design, like little tweaks here and there, just so they could get to work on the PS2. And I think at this point they've officially, at least at the recording of this video, they've officially ended support of the PS2 and are now only doing, I think, PC and Xbox 360, I think, or maybe just phasing out 360 and doing PC only. But we're also filming in 2024, so, at this point there's no more expansions. But jumping back to 2002, when the game came out, like, there was very limited classes, like your thief, your white mage, your black mage, your warrior. And then, there was advanced classes, and the level cap, I believe, at the time was only 50. When it came stateside later that year in November, it actually came with the first expansion pack, which I didn't know. I literally thought the game was called Final Fantasy XI Rise of the Xylart. Rise of the Xylart was literally the first expansion that included Dragoon and Ninja, and I think it upped the level cap to 75 at that point. Maybe it was 55. I can't remember, because at that point I just wanted to play the game. You know, I wasn't thinking about end game content or anything like that. And the way MMOs worked at the time, when this came out in the States, I think it was like November, October, because I had just started college that September, which in and of itself started off very strangely. The day before my orientation, I was I was at a house party with a group of friends, and this particular house we were at, it was a family of musicians, and they all listened to like Velvet Underground and Bob Dylan and stuff like that. And apparently nobody had to go to school until the week after. I started the day after Labor Day. At least in New York, that's how it rolled. And let's just say everybody had a little bit too much of the fun stuff in terms of drinking and everything else. And before I knew it, it was 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, and I was in the Bronx, and I had to figure out how to get back to Manhattan. Now, my dumbass, because this was before Uber, this was before apps and all that fun stuff, decided he would take a car service. Not a problem. Easy. They don't take card. It had to be cash, and I had no cash, so I had to walk to a train station. I luckily found an ATM by said train station, took out cash, had to dial, for those of you in New York who know, I don't know if it's a national thing, 777-7777, which is Carmel Rent-A-Car. They asked me which airport I was going to. I said, none. I have to get to Manhattan. They picked me up. I rolled into the house at 7 a.m., got up 45 minutes later, took a shower, still hungover, or drunk rather, and then went to my college orientation. This is how college officially started for me. So not on a good foot. In orientation, I kind of just sat there with a Diet Coke in my hand like this the whole time, barely functioning, thinking, I have to make friends here. I don't know anybody. I literally went to a college that none of my friends went to. And I was a little bit luckier when it came to high school because I had some people from my grammar school that went with me. But in this case, everybody was separated. All my friends went, some of my friends went to art school, admittedly in the city. A couple of them went to NYU. I live downtown, so I could always see them if I wanted to. But my closest friends all went to colleges either out of the city or at the very worst out of state. So it was the perfect and worst time to hear about an MMO in a franchise that you really enjoy. On one standpoint, yeah, you're going to have a game to play. But on the second standpoint, based on the way MMOs were designed and how Final Fantasy XI was initially designed, you're talking about a time sink. You're talking about a commitment. And when that comes to starting in a new school, freshman year, making friends, all that fun stuff, not a good time. But that was September. This game didn't come out till November. So, hype building up, trying to figure out what class I want to play. Ultimately, I decided on Dragoon because my boy Kane. And it's very strange. If for anyone who's ever played an MMO, you know how this goes. You have your class or your job or what have you, and you gear it out the way you like it. And then you see patch notes, and all of a sudden the character class you love so much is no longer good. And now you feel upset because of your time commitment, and then basically it's a balancing act back and forth. So at the time I finally unlocked Dragoon, they had just nerfed Pentathrust, which was a 5 thrust attack, which would basically just mean a Dragoon could just use special attacks over and over again because of the way it accumulated TP, which was the equivalent of the AP bar in Final Fantasy XI. They fixed that. I never got to experience the wackiness, but I didn't care because for me, I just wanted to play as a class I wanted to play as. And when I first started on Final Fantasy XI, the biggest decision you can make is creating your character name. I sat there for, no joke guys, an hour trying to think of a character name. And this was the hardest part for me for the longest time, because when it came to online personas and everything else, I mean, I didn't really role play or anything, but I always have a problem with remembering my character's name, right? So for the longest time, I would just put Alex. Easiest thing. But now I'm playing an MMO. I'm paying a monthly subscription. and I'm playing with people I don't know, I really don't want to put out my real name. So I decided on the next best thing. Alexi. I don't know what I was thinking, but I know what my influence was, because at the time I was really into Children of Bottom, which is a metal band, and may rest in peace. The great late Alexi Laiho was the lead guitarist and singer. I was a huge fan of them at the time. I listened to them religiously, listened to every album that came out throughout all their evolutions before I eventually dropped off of them. But Alexi at that point in time was my favorite guitarist. So I figured, hey, close enough, right? So now I have to pick my nation. And I have my choice between Windhurst, Sandoria, or Bastok. And honestly, Windhurst looked like Disneyland, which is where the Tarotaros come from, or Lalafels, if you play Final Fantasy XIV. And it's very much like what was really cool about this was that they kind of took like a cultural aspect of the different nations. It wasn't just, blue team, green team, red team. Sandoria was very much more like a French Victorian medieval setting. Windhurst was a little bit more of like a Mediterranean jungle setting. Think more like a little bit of like that islandish setting, like in one of the towns in Final Fantasy X, minus all the water, because it's basically just lakes and stuff with bridges and whatnot. It's really cool. More islandish, I would say. And then Bastok was more of like the Industrial Revolution, which is what I ultimately went with because I thought it sounded the most interesting, and it also had Sid as as one of the NPCs. So I figured that it made sense. And at least on my server, which was Unicorn, Bastok was like the laughing stock nation at the time. It was always last in everything because they would do like a weekly I guess you could say influence on the overall world, like who had control of different stuff, and that would give you access to different fast travel locations. And it was basically a push and pull game all the time. And for the longest time, Bastok literally was in the last place of everything, so we had to run everywhere. And Final Fantasy XI was not a small game by any stretch of the imagination. Huge open world with nothing in it. Conchnet Highlands, I remember having to run through that the first time ever. It literally took me 3 hours because I got lost. I bumped into Stray Mary. Stray Mary killed me. Stray Mary was a notorious monster, which is basically your equivalent of like a named monster or like a difficult one. And they would usually, I say usually because it rarely ever happened because the drop rates in this game were shit, would drop a very rare item. So in the case of Stray Mary, Mary's horn, I think, or the lullaby horn, I can't remember what it was, but essentially it enhanced the bard ability for lullaby. And it was something you would get at level 10 and you would use up until the level cap, specifically for that one fucking song. So I eventually would level up a bard and I'd be running around with like 50,000 instruments. But it was really cool at the time just to see all this stuff as a player on day one, because nobody really knew what was going on because the social media wasn't there yet. So coming into this and being on the same servers as the Japanese players, which they would eventually, if they didn't have it in there already, would put in a auto-translate system of common phrases, right? So you would hit a button, then you would type in HELL, and then it would give you the option to put hello, which would auto-translate it into Japanese for the Japanese player to understand. We would have full conversations. It was actually, for the time, it was very robust. But there were also, like, meme jokes in the whole thing, too. Like people would use it as substitutes for curse words. People would use it as substitutes for insults. And it was like a joke back and forth. But it was really fun. Like, it would be like, you can have this butt hurt, like stuff like that. And it would, in Japanese, it really wouldn't translate over. They would, a question mark would come back like, wait, what? But eventually they would get into the U.S. slang. And then it was weird and cool because at first there was a segregation. Like, the Japanese players rarely associated with the U.S. players, at least on my server. But over time, they started to intermingle more and more because it wasn't just a Japanese game anymore, it was international. And my link shell towards the end would actually have folks from all over the world, primarily States, Canada, a bunch out in Europe. I think we had 2 or 3 Japanese guys, and I think 3 or 4 Chinese guys, and a couple folks out of the Philippines. So we always had somebody on, but it was always funny because the Filipino folks that used to play would be like, it's always us at like 3 in the morning. And all of a sudden, Alex shows up. Because Alex don't sleep. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. We're talking about the baseline days. You know, coming out, I knew I wanted to play Dragoon, and the way Final Fantasy XI was designed initially was a time sink. You had quests and you had grinding. That was it. You would go out in the main area and you'd start beating on bats. You'd start beating on lizards. You go into the mines. You would start beating on more bats. You'd start beating on more lizards. And the battles were slow. They weren't turn-based. They were action-based. But you would have active abilities with cooldowns, which is, very common for an MMO these days. But because of the way the game was designed, you didn't have like a cooldown timer or buttons like you did for WoW. You would basically have a menu, just like a traditional Final Fantasy game. Now on PC, eventually you could configure macros, and PS2 as well, where you would do button combinations so you didn't have to go through the menus to like trigger your provokes, your berserks, maybe your barrages, your sneak attacks and stuff like that. And they were all on what I consider very aggressive timers. And then you also had a special ability per class called the 2 hour, which was an ability you could use once every 2 hours. So for Thief, you got perfect dodge, meaning nothing could hit you from a physical attack basis for 30 seconds. Paladins would become invincible for 30 seconds. Ranger would get a super attack. What was the other one? Warrior would get Mighty Strikes, which was basically nothing but critical hits for 30 seconds. White Mage would get Benediction, which would heal the whole party. And then for Black Mage, I think they got unlimited mana for 30 seconds. And then for Red Mage, they would get Chain Spell, which meant they could cast spells with no hindrance on recast times or casting... Yeah, basically just casting times until they ran out of mana. Or MP, rather. So... Of course, everybody day one is like, I want to see my 2 hour ability. Everybody's just busting them out on this like level 1 lizard that can't do anything. And it was really fun because it's all new. There was no social media. Everybody just knew Final Fantasy XI, Final Fantasy MMO. There's a monthly subscription. Let me ask my mom for a credit card. And everybody was just running around hitting stuff. And the way that monster engagements occurred was once you hit something, it was tagged to you exclusively. Unless you called for help, nobody else could interact, because Final Fantasy XI at its heart was a party-based MMO battle system, meaning once you reached a certain point, you couldn't solo anymore. You had to get a party of at least, I think it was 5 people. And then eventually the party makeups became very much a traditional Final Fantasy party makeup. A tank, some damage, a white mage, and a black mage. And you kind of got pigeonholed into that. To an extent, eventually, depending on levels and whatnot, you get a bit more creative. Endgame XP parties, for the most part, were just bards and warriors, or bards and rangers. And then somebody would be like, hey, I'm trying to level up my fucking white mage. Can I jump in? It's like, yeah, you could be the dead weight. Like, because you don't need it. Because you're just doing so much damage so fast. But at the beginning, it's slow going. It was very slow going. And the kicker was, they would give you XP chains, right? The faster you kill stuff, you get a little bit of an XP bonus. Kind of like we see in RPGs today. If you got to chain 5... you were considered elite, because that was very difficult to do with a traditional party setup. If you got to chain 6, you were like off the chain. Endgame, if you got sub chain 150, you were considered a scrub, because you were just killing stuff so fast. But at the beginning, that's what I'm trying to really hammer in on this. This game was designed to suck up your time. You would play for 4.5 hours and be like, oh man, I didn't gain any levels. Play for 4.5 hours. I died 6 times. I lost a level. Every time you died, you lost XP, and you could de-level. Endgame, you would have people de-leveling, and all of a sudden they'd be naked because all their gear, they weren't the minimum level to wear stuff anymore. And in the beginning, this was very difficult. Like, I would say the attrition of the people I initially started with once they got past that 30-day trial just cut in half because of the time commitment. The game was very unforgiving. It was actually really difficult because once you got to level 16, 17, 18, you had to do a quest to get 3 items so that you could unlock, I think it was sub-jobs, actually. You had to get 3 items out of Valkyrie Dunes from XP monsters that everybody was fighting, and you had to compete with drop rates, and you had to compete with 4 to 5 other people who also needed this at the same time. It was really, again, just designed to suck up time like you wouldn't believe. And sub-jobs were where the customization of this game really came into play. So you would basically start off with one job, warrior, let's say. And then you would unlock a sub-job at, well, I think it was level 18. And then basically you would level up another job. So we'll say thief. And then your sub-job would always be half the level of your main job. So if you were level 75 paladin, you'd be a level 37 warrior. But you had to make sure that you had your warrior leveled up at 37. If your warrior was only level 5, your sub-job level would be 35 or 5 or what have you. And your stats would alter accordingly, including your HP and MP. So if you had an under-leveled sub-job, you would not be as effective as somebody else. And leveling up with a lot of pickup groups, you saw this shit all the time. It was so annoying. People would literally, basically very archaic, looking for group flags and search menus and everything else. And obviously certain jobs always got invited to parties. Warrior and Dragoon were not one of them towards the mid-game. But in the beginning, nobody gave a shit. Everybody was just like, oh, cool, we have like 5 warriors. There's no healing. I'm out of here. And then somebody would literally leave the party, and then all of a sudden we get a white mage. And it was shit like that. It's like, dude, we're level 10. Who the hell cares? Like, but in hindsight, everybody's like, I have to level up as fast as possible. And there's no such thing at the beginning of these things. There really isn't, because you don't know where the fuck you're going. So all of this with sub-jobs and leveling and everything else, eventually you would get to Juneau, which was the main hub city. And this is where you saw all your traditional Final Fantasy stuff. Your high medieval port town, airships. Airships would be going back and forth between the nations. And here's the kicker with airships. You had to wait for the airship to come in. You had to wait for the airship to dock. You had to wait for the airship to leave. And then you had to wait for the airship to fly you back. So you getting on an airship to go back to your home nation, I'll say arbitrarily was like a 15-20 minute commitment. You have to buy a ticket to it. You have to wait. And it would leave without you. It didn't matter. If you walked out, you were out the money. It didn't matter at all. Your ticket was non-transferable. Because the only other real transportation was a ship out of Selbina, which was a little like fishing town out in the middle of I think it was Valkyrie Dunes, and that would just take you over to the Windhurst area, and I can't remember the name of that little town over there, but that I think was like a 15-20 minute boat ride, and sometimes you would get attacked by a kraken, and then if you were under level, you'd be thinking, oh cool, it's a giant kraken, and just whack and kill you one shot. There was a lot of that. I touched on Stray Mary earlier, and I can't tell you how many times I engaged the sheep and then saw the name, was like, oh, fuck, I'm dead. I would die, I'd de-level, I'd lose XP. Hours of progress gone within 5 minutes. And it wasn't like a Dark Souls where you could go back and get it. It was just gone. Again, designed to suck up your time. And that was really all there was to this game at the start. There was quests, yeah, but there was really no incentive to get into them other than the storyline beats. The rewards weren't all that great. I don't even think you got XP for doing them. There was no voice acting. because I couldn't afford it. So pretty much you would just pick a spot, you'd stand around, and you would basically shout that you were looking for group just so you could XP and level up. And then once you got to the minimum level where you could try to get your advanced classes, your Dragoon or your Paladin or your Ninja, you would go about doing the quest to unlock those. And some of them were easier than others. I can't recall any of them off the top of my head, but I can tell you the level cap quests were the first batch were actually really difficult. But for Dragoon, I think you just had to talk to a bunch of people. And then for Ninja, I think you had to go to Windhurst. So if you were like in like a Bastock or a Sandoria, you would have to fly to Juneau, or presumably get to Juneau, and then get on the airship to Windhurst, and then basically fly back and forth. But there was a lot of that. Again, designed to suck up your time. And making money in this game was not easy either. It wasn't like doing a quest like in WoW where you would get like an arbitrary amount of gold would just happen. This was Gil. Unless you were really hip on crafting and you were doing crafting in a trade that really wasn't that common in my server, it was woodworking and cloth craft. I did cloth. I got cloth to 100 plus 6. I had the glasses. But before that, I did woodworking, and I got that to I think 61 out of 99 before I dropped it, just because there was no money in it. But you had to not only grind for XP, but you had to grind for gil. Drops from enemies, some of it could be used in alchemy and stuff like that, and then you would make like pennies on the dollar, like not even anything. The economy in this game was driven by an auction house system. So you would get a bunch of materials that you spent hours trying to get, and then you put it up there for like 300 gil, and then you would get 300 gil, and then you were still trying to buy your latest armor piece from somebody who crafted it for 5,000 gil. So a lot of people were undergeared, underleveled, had subpar sub jobs, had no sub jobs. We had one person made it to level 25 without a sub job. I don't know how the hell that happened. And then you would put that into looking for group atmosphere where you'd be standing around for hours and people would just come and go, full parties, back and forth. And people, once you got a good party, you didn't fucking leave. You called out sick, you didn't go to school, you didn't do anything. And this is where I started to have difficulty with this game. I enjoyed it. I thought this was so much fun. The music was good. The gameplay was engaging. It was slow. But, I would say frequent conversations I would have in party, because it was always different folks, from all over the States. Everybody, you already knew you were fans of Final Fantasy because you were playing this game. But, I made my first real friend in Final Fantasy XI. His character name was Palpatine. He also had difficulty coming up with the name at the time. And if I remember correctly, he was going to school for education, and he lived out in Nebraska. And he was the most foul-mouthed son of a bitch. But, it was like, I would have never known that. And then, the next friend that I made was a guy who went by the name of Akon, after the musician. And he was a dad with 3 kids, and his favorite thing was eating cheesecake with Hennessy, which I discovered is the best combination in the world at the time. But we'd all just talk about life stuff and games. He talked about like how he played Final Fantasy 1 back on the NES. Palpatine's first one, I think, was Final Fantasy 8, and how he wanted to go back and play 7, but being in school, he was trying to get his roommate into this game because he was always playing it, etc., etc. And we would just talk about stuff. And, I eventually had like 2 or 3 friends. And if we were on, we all played together. But this is where the difficulty of this game comes in, and the time commitment. My grades were in the toilet, to say the least. This game came out in November. I had started school in September, and, again, new school, didn't know what I wanted to study. I was a freshman, all this fun stuff. But I saw a marked difference in how I was scoring on tests, and I was going into finals soon. I was already like, all right, I got to figure this out. Like, something gotta give here. And I also noticed that the time commitment to this game that I was investing was not only affecting my schoolwork, it was affecting my personal relationships too. Um, those of you who don't know, I am married. My wife is actually the same girl that hates MMOs because I would literally skip out on hanging out with her to play said MMOs, particularly Final Fantasy 11 because I've known my wife since high school. Um, and I remember the one time, this is where I realized it was really bad. She was spending the night at my house, which was a thing, not a big deal. And she was watching TV. I don't even remember what she was watching. And I was playing Final Fantasy 11. And she was like, oh my God. She's like, it's late. Let's go to bed. And I was like, yeah, you're right. And, we'd been together for a minute. So it wasn't like we were super duper engaged with each other at that time. And I lived at home. So I was like, okay, cool. I'll be in a minute. And, she turns off the light. She turns off the TV. She's in bed. At one point, she wakes up and she's like, dude, it's like 3 hours later. What are you doing? I had no idea. I was like, I got a party. And we were killing it. We were getting chain fives all over the place. I was like, I gotta stay until somebody leaves. I played until like 4 a.m. just to get to level 20. And at that point, I was like, oh my God. I literally picked a game over my girlfriend. That's not good. Like, that is really not good. And also going into my first semester midterms and everything else, that was not good. So I was like, okay, we'll just scale it back a bit. We'll figure this out, etc., etc. And I played this game up until, I'll say, the beginning of the spring semester. I probably dropped off of it around March-ish because coming out of midterms and everything else, like, I made alterations to my schedule and how I played this game so that I could potentially do a little bit better in school, and it just wasn't hitting. My studying habits, which usually were pretty good, went down the toilet. I was always one who would do his term papers a week before they were due, so the leading up to it, I could edit them. I was doing everything last minute, and that's for somebody who suffers from anxiety, that's not a good look. So you couple all that together, I was basically my own worst academic enemy. Luckily, I recognized this. So I did what any self-respecting person would do. I took my level 40 Dragoon at the time. Not 40. 32 or 30 Dragoon. And I deleted him. I deleted Alexei off the face of the universe. And I left the game on my PC and I walked away. And I walked away for several months. I basically just said, I can't play this game anymore. There's no end in sight. I'm never going to see the ending. I wasn't experiencing any of the story whatsoever. I was basically just grinding all the time. But this was the thing. I had tasted that MMO bug. I was dying for this euphoric drip feed of, for lack of a better word, gains. And nothing was doing it. And I tried different MMOs in the process of this too. And I remember I picked up, believe it or not, Star Wars Galaxies. Now, Star Wars Galaxies came out in 2003. I think it was like maybe May or June. Something along those lines. It was summertime. I remember that because that was the same year as the New York blackout. But it was Star Wars. It was something familiar. And guess what? It was just as freaking grindy. And the whole marketing behind it was they didn't want a ton of people playing as Jedi, so they made this weird system where some characters would be born with the innate ability to use the Force, which didn't really happen. And then there was a whole sequence of unlocks and all this other stuff. And again, this was all before social media. You know, there was websites like where people were just like throwing out theory crafting, like we're talking like playground, rumor mill stuff and all that crap. People, and nobody figured out how to be a Jedi for the longest time. That eventually the developer just came out and said, "Okay, fine. Here's how you do it." But it was interesting with this game because it really didn't require you to participate in combat. You could, of course, do the combat, which was actually pretty fun, or you could go into crafting. So I started off as a bounty hunter because Boba Fett, and then eventually I became a bioengineer, which basically was a pet class. But the interesting thing about it was you would bioengineer pets, and you could foreseeably sell them. So my dumbass threw himself on Yavin 4 and basically made a killing breeding rancors. The big bad. Everybody knows what a rancor is. I was breeding those things, and I was playing with their makeup to make them like the ultimate like attack pet class, where their attack was through the roof because this game inherently was broken right out the gate. And I would just sell those, and that's how I made a living in game. And I was playing this game for a bit, and I wasn't as obsessive about it because I didn't have really any personal connections with anybody, because I didn't really go to the cantinas and hang out and group up with people or anything along those lines. But what really came to be with this whole thing was I was at one of my friends was having a birthday party at her dorm at NYU. So I lived in the area of NYU, by the way. So walked over there, went to this dorm party, huge group of people, maybe 20-ish people, I'll say, maybe 20, 25. And one of my buddies from high school was there. He went to NYU, and he and I, we hung out pretty much on occasion at that point. And I was with my oldest friend, the one I always talk about, because he and I still hung out because that's how it rolled. And I'd be like, hey, I'm going over to NYU. You want to come? He's like, yeah. So he comes from his school. And then we go over to NYU, and we're hanging out, and we're all bullshitting and hanging around. And my friend from high school mentions that he's playing Final Fantasy 11. And I was like, oh, dude, I played that. I had to drop it. Like, I nearly flunked out of school. 3 months in. And he's like, no, it's different now. They tweak stuff. It's a little bit easier. I'm sure. So I was like, he was telling me about it. He had just got to level 50. He had beaten Matt. And I'm like, who the hell's Matt? Final Fantasy 11 had this thing with level caps where you had to do a quest for Matt. So the first one was you had to beat him in a fight. And he would basically be the perfect version of your class up until that point. And each class had a different way to beat him. So Paladin, you basically had to fight him. Thief, you actually had to either defeat him in combat or steal from him. And steal was on a 15-minute timer, so if you failed to steal, you had to do it all over again, and all this other shit. And you had to get papyrus papers each time. It was a mess. So he was telling me about all that, and I was like, oh my god, this sounds like such a pain in the ass. I'm not interested. But then he was telling me he was in a link shell, and link shells were the equivalent of a guild. And it was a very social group. Everybody was in college. Everybody was in the same boat. Freshman. He was a year older than me, so he was a sophomore. So, but everybody was in our age category, and he was like, it's actually really social. You should look into it. And I was like, no, I'm good with Star Wars Galaxies. And this is where the story gets really funny. I was thinking about that all night. I was like, it would be kind of fun to play Final Fantasy 11 with this guy. He is of higher level. If I need somebody to carry me through stuff, I can just ask him. I don't have to worry about doing all this bullshit to get my sub job unlocked, because I can just have him solo everything because he's much higher level than everything else, etc., etc. And I'm thinking about this over Jello shots with this guy who I just met. Come to find out, he is like a 30-year-old man. I don't know what he's doing at this party, and he's a chef. And he and I are just talking about life and finance. As an 18-year-old, 19-year-old, I have no idea about anything. And I'm just talking to him about this stuff. And we're just taking Jello shots back and forth. Because these Jello shots, nobody ate them. Nobody liked them. Him and I were the only ones who ate them. And one of my other friends comes over, and she's the one who made the Jello shots. And she goes, did I make them too strong? And I'm like, no, they're good. Why? She's like, because you guys are the only ones eating them. And I was like, oh, well, they're really good. She's like, I made 50. We had 10 left. So between the two of us, we did about 20 Jello shots each. So at this point, I'm like, oh my God, I have to go home. Like, I'm not gonna make, I'm not gonna make it. So I leave, and I lived close enough where I could walk home. So I walk home, get back into my room, and at the time, my room was, I'll say, a little bit of a remnant of the 90s. I had a Bill and Ted poster up. I had a Def Leppard poster up. I had a Dragonlance poster up. I had an Alf poster, like all this stuff. And I am, at this point, all the Jello shots just hit me all at once. And I was like, oh no. Oh man. This room's a mess. I gotta clean it. So it's like 2 a.m. I decide I'm gonna rearrange the posters. So here I am on top of a chair that's on wheels, by the way, trying to move the Bill and Ted poster a little bit higher on the door. I could have broken my neck. Following that, I sit down at the computer and I'm like, you know what? I'm feeling good. I'm a little bit awake. I'm going to play some Star Wars Galaxies. I remember booting up the game. I don't remember playing the game. I remember waking up the following day. I'll say like 11 o'clock in the morning, 12 o'clock in the morning. Luckily, it was a weekend. I don't sleep that late ever. If I do sleep that late, that means I'm either sick or I'm dead. So my mom came in checking on me to make sure I was alive. And she was like, oh my God, you smell like a brewery. What the hell were you doing last night? And I was like, oh, I was at the dorm with Joe and all the guys, and we were Jello shots. And I was like, and she's like, Jello shots? And I told her what a Jello shot was, and she's like, that sounds disgusting. So she walks out of the room. Sit down at the computer, and I apparently had left it on. Boot up my Star Wars Galaxies, and I'm in this beautiful palace looking place. And I'm like, wow, where did I log out? Open up my inventory. See, all my money is gone. All my credits are gone. And I'm like, what? What did I do? I bought a fucking mansion on Tatooine in the middle of the night. Do not remember any of it. It was like a 30-room mansion in the middle of nowhere. It was like surrounded by mountains. I wish I had a picture of it. I was like, oh my God. I kid you not, I had like 100 million credits. Like, I, again, was making bank selling rancors. And after that, I was like, I don't even know what the fuck to do. I dropped Star Wars Galaxies. I was like, drinking and MMOs just do not work. And once again, I saw something like from a social aspect just break something that I built up, because here's the thing with MMOs, and I know RPG people feel like this too. You get a ton of items, you never want to use them. I got a ton of money, I never wanted to spend it. I just wanted to be a dragon, and I just wanted to hoard all of it. And I spent it on this huge, decadent mansion for no reason. There was nothing in it. There was no furniture. It was literally just like a huge palace. I was like literally running through. I'm like, how many rooms is this place? And I want to be like, and who's the builder who had the supplies to actually manufacture this thing that I just walked up and bought it, apparently. Didn't remember a damn fucking thing. At that point, I said, enough of this shit. I'm done with MMOs. This is nonsense. I'm out. And I didn't play MMOs for a very long time. But at this point, a little bit of a strange thing happened. So that friend that I had gone to that party with, the one who would play Final Fantasy XI, when he went to school, when he went to college, he again went to NYU. We went to the same high school, and we weren't super close in high school, but we were close enough that we would talk. When he was a freshman in college and I was a senior in high school, he went to NYU and he dormed there, and I lived down there, and I was like, oh dude, if you ever want to hang out, like let's hang out, whatever. And I helped him move in and all that stuff because, again, I was down the street. And in hindsight, I get it. Freshman year of college, you don't want to be hanging out with high school friends. You want to make new friends, you want to push yourself forward and everything else. Once I was a freshman in college, it didn't matter anymore. It was just like, oh yeah, these are my friends from, these are my friends from other schools. It didn't matter what year you were in. You didn't have to explain, oh, this is the person from XYZ high school or anything like that. So that whole friendship dynamic changed, where I would get a phone call every Thursday or every Friday morning. Hey, do you have class today? Oh, you don't have class until like XYZ time. Or I didn't have class on Fridays. He'd be like, oh, dude, like I finished class at 11. Do you want to hang out? And I'd be like, yeah, cool. Also, we were hanging out every Friday. Myself, him, his girlfriend, and then my oldest friend, because he went to school downtown as well for art. So he would just walk over to my house, pick me up, and then we'd continue walking further downtown. We'd go to NYU. And this became like a weekly thing for the better half of 2 years. And underage drinking and all that fun stuff, and an incident with a friar that I don't even want to go into, at least not today. But through all that, I was always asking, oh, what's going on with Final Fantasy 11? Like, well, how's that looking these days, et cetera, et cetera. And, he would describe it and all this fun stuff, and I was like, kind of want to get back into it. Like, it was very tempting, but then I was just like, it's just a time commitment, man. Like, it's not a good look. And, he's like, oh, well, maybe when you have some free time, maybe over the summer, unless you plan to get a summer job. And when he said that, I was like, oh, shit, you're right. I really should get a summer job. Up until that point, I'd never had a summer job. So I was talking to my parents. I was talking to my dad about it. And, I was like, I don't even... At this point, freshman in college, I just finished my first year. We're talking like June, July-ish. And, yeah, pretty much June, July-ish. And I'm like, I really don't know what I want to do. Like professionally. Like I felt like I was supposed to know at this point. And he was like, well, listen, I got a buddy who works at the New York Circle Line. The boat that goes around the island. He's like, I could ask him if he has any openings. Maybe you can interview, or as I call them, audition, and see if he has a spot for you. So I said, okay. So he does. I go in there. I have my interview, and I get hired. Pretty much same day, if not next day. And then they give me a start date. And I was going to be a greeter. And what a greeter did was, at the time, you would stand outside, welcome people, explain the different boat tours and all that fun stuff. Nothing really crazy. But you're out in the sun all day. And as you guys can tell, I'm pretty much sun adverse. So it was a rough gig, not because of the heat. I did eventually get sunstroke, actually, because there was no shade whatsoever. We're literally on the water. If you're from New York, it's that spot next door to the Intrepid Museum. But I'll never forget, there was this one day I was out there, and it was really, really hot. Like, we're talking like 100-degree plus. No cloud cover whatsoever. And it was so hot, I actually had to roll up one of my sleeves like this, just because white shirt, I sweated through the whole thing, Undershirts didn't matter. They were still clear. And at that point, the general manager of the place goes over to my boss, and he's like, what the fuck is Alex doing? And he's like, what are you talking? He's like, oh, he looks like a thug standing out there. So then, of course, I got written up about that. And I was like, dude, this is rough. Like, I can't be the only one out there from 7 a.m. until 7 p.m. Like, that's ridiculous. It was a long shift, and it was barely minimum wage. It was very depressing, actually. So I would come home. My days off were terrible. My days off were like Tuesday, Thursday, like split days off. It was miserable. And what really came to a head was I would start to play Final Fantasy 11 again once I got home, just because I wasn't seeing anybody. I was literally doing 7 to 7, sometimes 7 to 6 if I was lucky. If it was dead, they would send me home, which it was summertime in New York, at a prime attraction for the summer. Oh, and the Beast was there, which was a speedboat. The Beast was next door, so there was always people. So I come home and I decided, you know what, I'm going to play Final Fantasy 11 again. I need something to pull me out of this. So once again, we sit down, and I'm trying to figure out what job I want to play. I'm trying to figure out which character. I'm trying to figure out all this stuff. I'm just like obsessing over it. And I was like, all right, you know what? Before we do any of that, either way, everybody starts out at a clean slate baseline. You can change any class you want. I need a name. And once again, I sat there and I was like, I'm not going with Alexi. I'm not going with Alex. I don't know what to pick. And then I was thinking, like, what are some cool words? And I was thinking end, send, I'll send her. And that's how I came up with my PSN name and the name I use pretty much everywhere else. I literally just took my name and added send to it, and then I went And in my mind, this was close enough to where I would literally recognize my name while also sounding a little bit different. The funny thing was, when I initially thought of it, I thought of it as Al's Ender, not Al Sender, which is kind of how it stuck. And to this day, any game that asks for a first name, last name, like a Persona game, I always put Alex Sender. And even my wife is like, what is that, your pen name? I'm like, I guess so. But that's literally how it came up. It is literally a name as old as 2003, which is kind of ridiculous. That's over 10 years old. And it was literally just me combining different words with my name until I saw something that stuck. So, created Al Sender. And then, as I said, I got heat stroke at this gig. And I had to call out on a Saturday because I literally just couldn't function. And then I got called into the GM's office and I got written up for calling out sick on a seasonal gig on a weekend. Mind you, I had a doctor's note and everything. And then at that point, I just resigned. I was like, fuck this, I'm out. So I agreed to work through July 4th, I think, or July 5th. And then after that, I had the rest of the summer off and, you know, I explained the whole thing to my parents. And they were like, yeah, you don't need this job. Like that's, like, I was there less than a month. But I was just like, they were like, that's ridiculous. Like, you did, like, even my dad was like, you know, who did hospitality for as long as he did. He's like, no, you did everything right. You got a doctor's note. You did exactly what you were supposed to do. Why were you written up about this? And I told him, yeah, it's my second one. He's like, what do you mean it's your second one? It was so stupid. It was such a fucking stupid job. And the irony is I still had a couple of friends who worked there. And they were like, every time they hired somebody to do what I used to do, they wouldn't even make it a month. They would quit. Because everybody got heat stroke and sunstroke. It was actually, like, legit really bad. But, you know, that's a story for another day. But because of this job and how negative it was, that's really what propelled me to start up on Final Fantasy XI again. So while the quote-unquote first arc was really me just playing it and grinding and everything else, the second act of my time with Final Fantasy XI is really where I hit my stride, and I started to make a lot of different friends while playing this game. But we'll cover that in another video. Anyway, I've been Alex, and I'll see y'all next time. Take care.